Well, welcome and God bless everybody. It's great to be with you. Today the topic is choose your chains wisely. It was August of 79 AD, that is, when it happened. It was about 10 years after the Gospels were penned, a full 15 years after Paul wrote his final opus, the epistles to Timothy and Titus. It happened 15 years after Nero burned the city of Rome and then blamed the Christians for doing it and then persecuted them. He even used Christians wrapped in sticks as human torches just to entertain the people of Rome after that. In 79 AD, Italy's angry Mount Vesuvius erupted. The blast sent a giant plume of ash, pumice, and rock so high into the sky that people were able to witness it from hundreds of miles away. 18-year-old Pliny the Younger watched in awe the eruption of Vesuvius from across the Bay of Naples. He wrote in his journal that the cloud looked like a giant pine tree that rose to a great height on a short trunk, on sort of a trunk, and then split off into branches. The first of its debris fell on Pompeii was just a dusting of fine-grained ash. This was just a warning shot. It was about 90% of the population of 20,000 people escaped that day at that time. But around 2,000 people remained behind to ride out the storm. Now, why they stayed is a mystery. Was it personal possessions to protect? Because of looters? Or were they slaves ordered to remain behind? Or were they locals who had no other place to go because Pompeii was their home? That's all they knew. Maybe they just remembered that 16 years prior, another gigantic earthquake, but not an eruption, had shaken the resort town, splitting 2-foot-thick stone walls right in half, and they lived to tell about it. So maybe they were just sitting it out. I don't know. But in a brutal eruption the following day, August 23rd of 79 AD, a glowing blast exploded from the volcano, releasing 100,000 times the thermal energy of a World War II era atomic bomb. The deadly cloud shot 21 miles into the air and pushed out 1.5 million tons of hot ash per second. This discharge buried the lovely city under 15 feet of steaming ash and pumice. At the same time, a pyroclastic flow thundered down the glowing mountain at 450 miles per hour, tipping the thermometer at 1,800 degrees. That's hot enough to melt brass, bronze, and silver. Every living thing that had moisture any living thing had the moisture sucked completely out of it in an instant. Now, Pliny the Younger also wrote, broad sheets of flame were lighting up many parts of Vesuvius. Their light and brightness were the more vivid for the darkness of the night. It was daylight now elsewhere in the world, but there the darkness was darker and thicker than any night. End of quote. He also wrote that he wrote that, I believed I was perishing with the world and the world with me. See, it was scary for him to watch. And while trying to rescue frightened Pompeians with his fleet of small boats, Pliny's brave uncle was suffocated by the sulfuric gases and fine dust. It's sort of like a powder that would be similar to if you bought a bag of cement at the hardware store or at a big box store, and then you just shoved your face into it and breathed. That's what that dust is like. The once posh resort town of Pompeii, built in the 7th century BC, a resort town that sported the homes of Rome's elite, would now lay silent, buried, frozen in time for almost 2,000 years. Now, one of my most memorable stops while visiting Italy was that ancient Roman leisure city of Pompeii. And researchers have been digging it out for over 200 years, yet still over 1/3 of the city remains buried along with its secrets. Now, besides the bodies of those who decided to stay, frozen for all time in the shape they fell, Archaeologists have excavated complete loaves of round bread, clay jars full of figs, nuts, seeds, intact sculptures of some prosperous family, vivid murals painted on parlor walls, intricate mosaic floors that would be envied by the rich of today, multi-level homes for all economic classes with underground tunnels for slaves to work unseen, elaborate baths with heated floors, brothels with graphic pornographic pictures painted on their walls, markets, roadside fast food shops, and in elongated earthenware wine containers. See, the curbed roads were built to last. They're still usable today. We walked right down them. And they're made with these heavy laid stone pavers, each of them about a foot big. I don't know how heavy they would have been. And they're etched deep with the tracks of chariots and carts that had ran over them for the 700 years prior to 79 AD. It was sort of weird to see, but it all ended. And the amazing city of Pompeii, it also had built-in plumbing made with lead pipes, a citywide water system fed by aqueduct, with stone pressure relief valves that would overflow and clean the streets at intervals, and they even had flushing toilets. So they were way, way, way ahead of their time. They used concrete. They used cement, which we thought wasn't invented until about 1900. But the Romans used it 700 BC. So it just got lost during the Dark Ages. You know, walking through Pompeii was like being lost in time. It was so modern, yet so ancient. And I felt transported. When I walked out of the city back into the town, all of a sudden you heard cars and the noises, and it was like I'd been in a whole different world for a couple of hours. See, we walked into the center. When we first got there, we walked into the center of the amazingly well-preserved open-air Roman amphitheater that once seated 20,000 screaming fans. Now, also, Pink Floyd did a concert at that same thing, you know, way back in the day. I think it might have been 79, 1979. I spun slowly around when I was standing in the center of that open air amphitheater, and I looked around at all the seats and tried to imagine what it must have felt like from a floor perspective with thousands of Romans screaming their lungs out. It must have been deafening, yet dreadful, because there would have only been one reason you were down there. In the center of the arena, I noticed a thick rusted metal loop. It was about as thick as my finger, and it was anchored into a stone, and then attached to it was a broken chain link. And I asked our lovely Italian tour guide what was the purpose of this anchor point. And she told us in her well-rehearsed broken English that this is where they would chain criminals and Christians, weaponless with nothing but their bare hands for protection. And then a gated door would screech open and a hungry lion would stalk into the arena in search of an easy meal. The crowd would go wild with bloodthirsty excitement. And this vicious mauling was just to ramp the spectators into a frenzy for the main event, the gladiators. Now, what would it have been like to have been chained to that anchor point, so public, so vulnerable? A lion slowly approaching, crouched, muscles flexed for action, its head low and its eyes locked onto your eyes. The crowd on their feet screaming in support of the lion. Well, good thing we don't live in 79 AD as Christians. With some of you, I feel sorry for that lion. Being physically chained and used for bait might have been an impossible situation for those early Christians because they didn't choose those chains. Today we're going to talk about the chains that we choose. Like the title, Choose Your Chains Wisely. So what is it that chains us? What is it that chains us? What holds you back? What holds us back? What keeps us from reaching our potential? There has to be a chain if you're not reaching your goals and your potential. What chains do we allow to hold us? It has to be something that we have accepted. How do we break free of these things? What chains do we allow? Our fears and the fear of death top the charts, like Hebrews 2:15 says, who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So fear of death must have a lot of masks, and it must get people to do a lot of things or don't do a lot of things. The lack of education, or possibly the craziness that comes with too much education and not enough common sense, is something that could hold people back. Acts 26:24 says, Paul, thou art beside thyself. Much learning doth make thee mad. That's what some Roman leader thought of Paul. Sometimes governments without borders control people. They think they own the world. They tax you into an economic bracket and slowly remove freedoms as we seek more safety. Acts 5:29 says, we ought to obey God rather than men. Ever heard that? We ought to obey God rather than men. This is the Christian attitude that drove the Romans bloodthirstily crazy. It sent them into a frenzy. The Romans hated and despised this new belief system that we call Christianity. The Romans were very tolerant of the people they conquered and their religions, as long as those religions had ancient roots and had a definite ritual. They had to have deep roots through time, and they had to have ritual. And this usually included Judaism. But Christianity had no roots, and it had no ritual. Now, Christianity during the first century was much different than Christianity of today. It allowed freedom of thought and action like had never been seen before on earth. There was no condemnation. No condemnation. Forgiveness was huge. Love was key. These were not 3 tenets of the Roman way of life. It was obey or die. Christianity had no ritual at all, unless you include mentioning during meals the broken body and the shed blood of Jesus. That's as close to ritual as we have, or are supposed to have. Christianity has changed. It's morphed more into what the pagans would have had, deep and steeped with ritual. But we're not talking about that, the Christians of 79 AD. Here's a quote. Have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourselves for godliness. 1 Timothy 4:7. I like that. Train yourself in the art of and/or science of godliness. Train yourself to be godly. That's what Paul was saying. So godliness must be something that we do in our mind. This freedom in Christ and desire to talk about it all the time smacked of heresy and apostasy to the Romans. The Romans they demanded that everyone not only perform certain rituals at certain times to certain gods or a god, but they believed that the emperor himself was a deity and worthy of worship. Now, would Christians do this? No. And so that made the Romans a bit peeved. And the Romans were highly religious and even more superstitious. A rooster crowing at the wrong time would call for a special incantation. New brides were carried over the threshold of a new home so she wouldn't trip and bring a bad omen that they would also need an incantation for. Of course, that's where we get carrying the bride through. It comes from Roman superstition. Spirits could be found in inanimate objects like a rock. In fact, all rocks had them. They thought the toilets had spirits of their day. So spirits could be found, children were told that monsters would kill them if they misbehaved. So raise a child up in the way that he should go. Even randomly seeing an owl meant impending disaster. And they believed this. They believed it. People wore amulets to ward off evil. And they still do. They still do. You know, they still do in American sports. You know, they wear their hats a certain way. They don't shave, when they're on a winning streak, or they're in the playoffs. They don't change their undershirt. There's always something. That's all the same kind of superstition. And that all boils back to spiritualism, really. Because it has nothing to do with a beard doesn't make you a better player, you see. But if you think it does, maybe it does. I don't know. I'm not going to weigh in on that one. So Galatians 4:8-11 from the ESV says, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved by those that by nature are not God's. But now that you've come to know God, or rather be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and the worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain." This kind of talk about worthless religious practices drove the Romans absolutely nuts. That's why they persecuted Christians, because of freedom. When people aren't free, they hate everybody who is. Wise old Pliny the Elder, the guy who suffocated before this, the uncle who died in Pompeii, tells us that, quote, "If one wishes a child to be born with black eyes, the mother should eat a shrew during the pregnancy." Natural History 30.134. People believe that stuff. I remember old Italian women telling Josephine when she was pregnant that don't raise your hands in the air or you'll lose the baby. One old woman told her that if you don't take a bath because you'll drown the baby. I thought, where's this stuff come from? It's crazy. Pliny also wrote about a way to suppress someone's sexual desire. Quote, "A man's urine in which a lizard has been drowned is an ant-aphrodisiac potion." So if you just don't want to feel sexy, then drink urine that a lizard has drowned in. I mean, it's like, who tried that one? I think it might just work. He also wrote that to enhance sexual performance, one should consider, quote, wearing as an amulet a rooster's right testicle wrapped in ram skin. I never looked at it. No, well, never mind. This is crazy stuff. So remember the record in Acts 19 about the attack on the Christians because of the perceived threat on the great goddess Diana? And this happened just after a record that was shared that said, "So mightily grew the word of God and prevailed." Acts 19:20, you know that one. And this is where Paul was informing the pagans that gods cannot be made with men's hands. Now, they made a lot of money selling statues of Diana because it was a very popular deity in Rome. And Romans loved their gods. They loved them. And one crazy ritual that surrounded the worship of this goddess Diana took place in the groves in a wooded area on Lake Nemi, just south of Rome, along Via Appia, which is a highway of sorts, the Appian Way. And the high priest of Diana was always a fugitive slave who became priest by murdering the current priest. That's how you became priest of Diana. And this was allowed and expected behavior. The Romans allowed it, and they expected this to happen. It's just the way it was. It's always been that way, always will be that way. The new priest would always carry a sword and be ever alert, and he was always ready to face the next challenger while he performed his priestly duties. A side note on slaves, people have a certain picture in their mind of slaves, but Roman slaves were from the lands they conquered. They were always from the lands they conquered. The Romans of Pompeii were all of 5 feet tall, and I saw their crumpled bodies, and they're about 5 feet tall. So people weren't very big in those days. So they were impressed but with the sheer size, strength, and golden hair of the savage Brits when they invaded Britannia to take it over for Rome. And they would enslave these people. And they were huge compared to the Romans. But they were considered ignorant people who could never learn music or art. The most coveted of all slaves were educated Greeks. And there are almost no black slaves because in Italy, the Romans never even tried to conquer the sub-Saharan Africa. They stuck with the Mediterranean coasts and the British Isles, and that was it. That's as far as they went. Now, all these deeply grained religious and political superstitions were flatly rejected by the believers in Christ, hence the ensuing persecutions. Now, regarding religion and superstition, choose your chains wisely. Be wise about the superstitions you decide you're going to grab onto. You see, remember, we still ought to obey God rather than men. Now, other things that chain a soul are stubbornness, ego, self-loathing, right? You know, self-introspection, self-hate. You know, a good Christian rule of thumb is to find a way to nourish and cherish yourself, just like Christ did for the entire body of believers. Doesn't Ephesians 5:29 say that? Yeah. Could peer pressure or conformity limit us? Want to conform to what the world's doing? Yeah. We all dress like everybody else pretty much. You see, Romans 12:2 says, don't be molded by this world, right? It's hard not to be. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, hanging out with bad friends are going to corrupt your habits. You know, so be careful who you hang out with. These are all chains that we allow. You want to hang out with this group. They don't want you to hang out with them. You're going to get your feelings hurt. You're going to feel lower about yourself instead of finding people that love you and want to be near you. What about race, culture, sex, finances? Are people controlled and corralled by any of those? Certainly, absolutely. Concerning race, didn't we all come from the same bloodline way back when? Acts 17:26 says that, right? We all came from one blood source. Don't even get me started about the thick, invisible chains that religion slips onto us, you know, when we first show a hunger for truth. By the way, what is truth? What is truth? Can we notice can you notice that emotional chain that's tugged you back your entire life? It's hard to see, folks. Sometimes you got to talk to somebody. Sometimes we've got to listen to what other people are saying. You know, whatever it takes. Sometimes the Word will just open our eyes to it. You know, can we discover, break, or release ourselves from whatever's been limiting our movements toward our dreams? We should be able to see it. Every Christian that was ever chained in that Pompeii stadium would hope that you can learn to release yourself from mental chains, because they were not able to release themselves from those physical chains. You know, you can be chained up and still free. Did you know that? You can have physical chains and still be free. So choose your chains wisely. So now, what sets us free? What sets us free? Now, this is a funny one. I actually typed it in. I asked Google, what sets us free? And the top choice made me laugh out loud. The number one Google search on what sets us free was fashion. According to Google, fashion sets us free. Now, I laughed, and I found my wife and told her what Google had just told me, and with a blank face, she said, so? And then she just stuck her left foot out, struck a pose, and asked me how her recently purchased in Rome handmade leather shoes looked. I thought, oh, word. Oh, my word. I guess when in Rome. So maybe fashion sets her free. So I know very little about fashion except for running shoes and backpacks. My favorite store is REI, which is more suited for a running trail than a fashion runway. Now, the second and third choices that little Miss Google showed me were that truth and the sun can make us free. So fashion, the Son, and truth can set us free. You know, fashion, truth, and the Son. Now, I'm going to focus on the latter two. Maybe you want to focus on fashion. But the truth will make us free. John 8:31 and 33 from King James. Then Jesus said to those Jews which believed on him, if ye continue in my word, then are ye my disciples indeed, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. To know the truth means you have a close and active relationship with truth. We're not talking about just head knowledge here. This isn't getting a college education that quickly drains out of your head, within a year of graduating. We're not talking about that. This isn't just learning verses either, like you did in vacation Bible school. You see, it's integrating those words that work into your life. That's truth. That's your truth. You see, when we have so ingrained the truth into our lives that it becomes as much a part of us as our hands, our feet, our brain, our heart, then we've been made free in that area of our life. That's what he said there. The truth makes you free. That word make is that word. It's integrated into. You integrate into it and it integrates into you. See, the word free means to be liberated, exempt from liability. Exempt from liability. You think the Romans like to hear that? No. Unrestrained is another thing that word free means. And it also means not a slave. Not a slave. That's what the word free means. You're liberated. You're exempt from liability. You're unrestrained, and you are not a slave. Now, something that I thought of here is truth and borrowed truth. This is sort of a side note, but there's a difference between truth and borrowed truth. Remember, if truth makes you free, what is the difference between truth and borrowed truth? Well, as an adult, if you believe something simply because someone else told you it was the truth, that's what borrowed truth is. We've all been a part of different churches, maybe different religions, and there's things that you once believed and then maybe you don't believe so much anymore. Maybe you were raised in a certain religion or denomination or ministry, and now you don't believe the same. Well, it's because it wasn't your truth. You borrowed it. You didn't integrate it. It's got to be integrated into us. It's not yours. That's borrowed. True truth is totally part of you, and you are part of who God is. That's truth. You're just integrating God into you. Now, he already lives there, but you integrate the thoughts of God into you. So much so that people can't tell the difference. Have you ever go back home after being gone a number of years and people go, what happened to you? You changed. Something happened. You look different. You glow. There's something about you. It's because you took on a truth. You took on truth. You integrated the truth. Now you're a different person. You are no longer who you were as a child. In most ways. See, we listen to a certain genre of music. Or we wear certain clothes because we think that's what we're supposed to do, because all our friends do that. Well, that's a type of truth borrowing. Just as an example. You see, it's not really ours. If you wore what you really wanted to wear all the time, it probably wouldn't be what you wear all the time. It's just some things are just acceptable at work, and some things aren't, right? You see, it's still like borrowing. We do that, but we do that with thoughts. And we have to be careful with that because thoughts will become beliefs, and beliefs become a lifestyle. A lifestyle becomes a destiny. If we're in a certain religion or denomination or ministry because it's all we know, or because it's just expected we believe these certain things, that's a borrowed truth. And folks, that won't stick with you. It's like putting clothes on, not putting clothes in. We got to be clothed on the inside with this stuff. See, it's different. So truth, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. It's integrating the truth if you want that kind of freedom. Verse 33 says, they answered him, we be Abraham's seed, and we were never in bondage to any man. How sayest thou that you shall be made free? Well, first off, the children of Israel were in fact slaves in Egypt way back in the day, right? You know, Jesus isn't talking about physical freedom. He's talking about the mental, emotional, and spiritual types of freedom. How do you think prisoners of war handle it? Some people die. They can't stand that captivity. Other people know they're going to get out, and they just keep their head together. They think the right thoughts for a long enough time, and pretty soon they're out. The truth that sets you free is a truth that has literally become part of you. It lives in your words. It lives in your thoughts. It lives in your actions. It's obvious. This is something that you have to do. This is something that you do. The truth doesn't make you free. You make the truth make you free. It's a system of thinking. You see, you have to live the truth that you want to be. True freedom can even be had while in physical chains. Chalk one up for the Pompeii Christians. You see, they knew that truth adopted and lived had already set them free. Now we're going to get to the third one way to be set free. You got fashion, you got the truth. Now it's the Son. The Son will make you free. John 8:36 says, if the Son therefore shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed. And now we switch to the third Google point, which is the Son will make us free. Fashion, truth, and the Son. In that order. I'm sure God doesn't put it in that order, but Google did. And it seems to be saying that the Son, Jesus Christ, will liberate us, does it not? You see, liberate us from what? Liberate us from what? If you're already free from truth, what more freedom do you need? Well, the following context, or the context following this verse, is a section of Scripture that deals with people who cannot integrate any type of truth into their lives because they've chosen to worship a God other than the one that we worship. They literally worship the God of this world by fully assimilating into the course of this world. And that's all it takes. Just to fully assimilate the world, to believe everything and to go totally according to the course of the world, then the truth will have no place in you or me. But we can't be those people. See, they worship that God of the world. They've allowed themselves to be blinded from the truth, like 2 Corinthians 4:4 says. You know, how the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ should shine unto them. It's blinded minds. They can't see it. They don't want to see it. They absolutely don't want to, because they don't want to see the Christ. Even Christians today, a lot of them don't really believe in a living Christ. They believe in the ethics of Christianity, but not the integration of Christianity. And that's what we're talking about here. The Son shall make you free. Now, choosing to believe in the Son of God is still a good choice. You know, it's a great choice. You know, the Son can and will make you free. Really, really, really free. That's what indeed means. It means really, really, really. A whole really lot. You know, I mean, it's a lot. The Son will really, really, really make you free. So what kind of freedom? Is it the same mental freedom we're talking about here? See, I'm thinking about, you know, it has to be more than that. It has to be a spiritual freedom. You see, choose your chains wisely, because they may be with you a long, long time. You see, choose truth. Choose it. Integrate it. And then also choose the Son. You see, and then you can have a lifestyle, not just now, but forever. Don't you think those first century Christians that were put to death in the Colosseum in Rome or in Pompeii What do you think they had running through their head? It had to be something like, okay, you know, my life may end now, but in reality, I'm going to be around forever. I mean, because the first thing ever taught by Paul was Thessalonians, and it talked about the return of Christ and the new body and all that kind of good stuff, right? So they had this stuff in their heads. How do you deal with something like that? You got it. So their life was bigger than their life. You see, that is something you don't do. The Son, you don't. It's something that happens to you, whereas truth is something that you have to make happen. Does that make sense to you? So it takes both. Now in review, every chain is a choice, one we determined or one we allowed. When Nero persecuted the Christians of Rome, some made their way down to the resort town of Pompeii, which isn't that far south of Rome, and ended up as the opening act for the main event, the gladiators. And they were chained to an anchor point and attacked by wild animals. The heaviest chains we carry, and even they carried, were not made of metal. You know, they're made of mental. And we allow ourselves to be manhandled by others' words or by culture or by popular politics or by beliefs forced upon us by somebody else. Those are the heaviest of chains, and they have controlled societies for tens of thousands of years. You see, Google said that fashion, truth, and the sun are what set us free. Now, I'm not sure if fashion really sets most of us free. Maybe some of you in the room, you see. But I do know that truth and the sun will absolutely, really set us free. Truth is something that we need to do. We make truth as an active part of us. It cannot be separated from us any longer. And the Son is something done for us. We believe in Him, and we are set free spiritually both now and for all eternity. I think the early Christians had that one down pat. The action I want you to take is to put on the truth so completely that you become truth. And the benefit to you will be freedom from bondage now and throughout all eternity. And that comes with choosing the Son. There's not a chain on earth that can bind us other than the ones that we allow. Choose your chains wisely. God bless.